Good afternoon. My name is Kelly Roberson. I'm the Executive Director here at the Center for Alcohol Policy. And as I reviewed the registration list for this webinar, I noticed a few new names. So as a primer for this conversation, wanted to share the mission of the Center for Alcohol Policy, which is to educate about alcohol, both its uniqueness and its regulation. The center has several ways in which we accomplish this mission, including conducting a national survey on alcohol regulation, publishing reports related to this unique product, and also hosting an annual alcohol law and policy conference, which I know many of you have attended. And if you haven't, here's my early plug. August 26th to the 28th next year. Please join us, save the date. But for today's event, I think it slots in perfectly with all of those educational initiatives. With that said, welcome to our webinar celebrating Repeal Day, or for the purposes of today, the 90th anniversary of the ratification of the 21st Amendment. Let me introduce you to our guests. I'm very pleased to be joined by Brannon Denning, who is Associate Dean and Professor at the Cumberland School of Law at Samford University. Brannon is also an advisor for the Center for Alcohol Policy and has authored numerous law review articles such as Smokey and the Bandit in Cyberspace, and many others, including several that have also been cited by the United States Supreme Court. Brannon also helped write the introduction to the important alcohol treatise funded by John Rockefeller, Toward Liquor Control. That would be the second edition. Right, Brannon, you were not around in 1933 to write that first one?
I wasn't.
Okay, just making sure. We'll discuss that one later. And I'm also joined by Mark Lawrence Schrad, who is Professor of Political Science and Director of Russian Area Studies at Villanova University. Mark received his Ph.D. in Political Science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2007 and is the author of 3 books on alcohol politics with Oxford University Press. The first one being Political Power of Bad Ideas, Networks, Institutions, and the Global Prohibition Wave, published in 2010. The second one, Vodka Politics, Alcohol, Autocracy, and the Secret History of the Russian State, which has been translated into over, I think, about 6 languages around the globe. And his most recent book, Smashing the Liquor Machine, A Global History of Prohibition, which won the coveted Kirkus Star, as well as the award for Best Book in Historical International Relations from the International Studies Association. This book right here. This webinar will explore the unique nature of alcohol regulation in the United States and beyond, prohibition in the 21st Amendment, and dive into some of the issues and debates surrounding its consideration and ratification. In today's conversation, we'll also learn more about the environment before the passage of the 18th Amendment and the era of prohibition that followed. And then we'll chat about today's honoree, the 21st Amendment. So with that, gentlemen, welcome. Today is a big day, a 90th birthday for an amendment to our Constitution. This is something we've done 27 times. 10 of those were packaged into the Bill of Rights. We have 2 amendments about alcohol, only 1 about free speech. Are we over-indexing on alcohol, or are we just indexing? Brannon, what are your thoughts? Kick us off.
Well, I think that it does sort of highlight the uniqueness of alcohol and what a central role it's played, both legally and sort of politically in the country. We began the great experiment with the 18th Amendment, and that was largely a response to Supreme Court decisions that had made it difficult for states to pursue their preferred alcohol policies because of the limits on their ability to regulate interstate commerce. The experiment was deemed unsuccessful, and an elite movement began to agitate for its repeal. Those efforts then culminated in the ratification of the 21st Amendment, our second alcohol-related amendment, and importantly, it enshrined in the Constitution that priority for alcohol regulation, or sort of the main locus of alcohol regulation, would remain with the states.
Yeah, Mark, anything to add as far as social, public health, religion, religious, and other factors that came into this debate?
Yeah, it's always been strange to me, like as as you grow up and are taught sort of civics and even as a kid about sort of the amendments to the American Constitution, and you see it as kind of this living document that is constantly being updated and whatnot. And so when you're learning all about these amendments. Eventually, you get to the 18th Amendment and says, "Thou shalt not trade in alcohol," which seems very, very strange from a modern perspective. And then of course, you get 19th Amendment, women can vote. This makes sense. Okay, we're back on track with things that make sense. And then you get the 21st Amendment that says, okay, just forget about that 18th. And so that has always been like an utterly fascinating thing to look at, like just that basic question of what goes into this. What are those different factors that cause prohibition and prohibitionism? And especially with the benefit of hindsight being 2020, how did we get it all so wrong? There is sort of universal understanding that this was quite a mistake or at least an overstep. So that sort of kicks off a lot of this analysis and investigation into all those factors that do come into both the 18th Amendment and the 21st Amendment to repeal it.
Oh, I guess
I'll mention one other thing about the uniqueness of the 21st Amendment. It is the only amendment in our Constitution that was ratified via specially called ratification conventions, as opposed to being sent to the legislatures of the states. And I think that probably, that choice that Congress made was a deliberate one. I think that they viewed these specially elected conventions as perhaps that they were going to be less susceptible to outside influences that would have opposed repeal than would individual legislatures.
Huh. Great addition there. Mark, I wanted to go back to you a minute here. We have your book here. It's fascinating. It's quite thick. I feel like every chapter, it's great, but I was pleased from a bad reader's perspective to know that there are a lot of wonderful notes that take up a few pages here. But I wanted to ask you about the book, why you wrote it, what you learned, having this perspective of an international prohibition and alcohol imperialism. I mean, I think every continent is mentioned, maybe Antarctica. I haven't gotten to that chapter yet. If it is, sorry. But tell me more about it, the inspiration and what you learned in this whole process, which I'm sure was quite lengthy.
It's and again, apologies. It wasn't meant to be that big. And honestly, it really wasn't meant to do much with regards to the United States, right? And so the I guess the onus in this and the background to it and sort of the genesis was what I was mentioning earlier, trying to figure out, okay, what went so wrong way back, a century ago, that it seems to me like if there are, and I know I'm probably talking to a very sort of partisan audience, and a lot of people have their politics and left and right. It seems like there's an almost universal recognition, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, that in American history, the prohibitionists are the bad guys. Right. And so, and they're the ones who are, if you hear it in sort of contemporary parlance, prohibitionists are the ones who want to take away your freedom, take away your liberty to drink and do what you want to do, and all that. And it's like, okay, well, that seems so counterintuitive and so, anti-American in so many ways. I was like, okay, well, then how did this ever get passed? How did this ever get, into our Constitution, if we can now look back at it and be sort of so universally condemning, sort of the impetus behind it? And so, I kind of began with the conventional wisdom on prohibition, which is kind of that cutout of, I remember in 2016, when Trump was elected, that on CNN, you had Van Jones got up on TV and he explains what just happened. And he uses this one word, it's a white lash. He says, what we just witnessed was a sort of this conservative reactionary backlash against the product, against modernization and immigration in the United States. And I was like, okay, I don't know if that explains what happens in 2016, but that is the exact explanation in sort of the literature for how we got to prohibition. There's this whole notion that it was a symbolic crusade of Midwestern Bible thumping evangelicals who want to tell you what you can and can't do. And I said, okay, well, I'm not entirely sure that was the case, but I certainly know it's not the case in the other places that I study. You know, again, I had this other book on Russian politics, a drunk history of Russia, and Russia was the first prohibitionist country, and so there aren't a whole lot of Bible thumping Midwestern evangelicals in Russia. And looking at other cases, there are 11 other countries and empires that undertook prohibition all about the same time. And progressive areas, Sweden, looking at Belgium, looking at Finland, looking at Scandinavia, but also in imperial areas. If you look at most of the African continent, if you look at sort of temperance movements in India and Australasia and all over the place, there's just so much more to that story. And so what happened, and sort of the genesis of it, is that the first the way that it was originally proposed, it was going to be nice, neat, like 8 chapters, looking and saying, okay, well, we think we know what prohibition was about in the United States. Let's just put that up on the shelf for a bit. Let's go see what prohibition was about in the rest of the world and see if there was anything that we can find that we can lend to the American experience. And so I go and I spend many years rifling through through all these archives in different countries, different continents, in India and in Botswana, in South Africa and in Russia and Scandinavia, Germany, all over the place, and British Isles, obviously a big part of this as well. And one of the things that you find is that in all these different areas, the people who were most, I guess, enamored with temperance and prohibitionism were sort of the most marginalized communities. And so I think the key to all of this, and the key to understanding prohibition and prohibitionism and figuring out what it was about and putting it in terms that we can understand nowadays, is to recognize that 100 years ago, nobody ever talked about alcohol prohibition as a phrase. That's a fairly new, like 1950s designation. The people back then talked about prohibition of the liquor traffic, and that was a big deal, right? And so there is a big distinction to be made, and it seems like a very semantic one, but a big distinction to be made between alcohol and the liquor traffic, or the alcohol traffic, or what have you. And so trafficking in something is, it is predatory capitalism at one degree, right? And so it's okay for me to say, I'm against human trafficking. That's making money off trafficking human beings, and I think that that's problematic. But that doesn't mean I'm necessarily anti-human beings. I'm very much pro-human beings, right? Same sort of thing with the liquor traffic. It was one thing to be against the trafficking in this highly addictive substance that could get people impoverished and addicted and whatnot. And that's a different thing than sort of the substance of what's in the bottle. And so that became like a very big element there to distinguish. And it's like, oh, okay, this isn't so much about the stuff that's in the bottle. It's about the use of it by predatory states, by predatory capitalists to exploit and keep people down, which is why temperance and the movement against that, it tends to be very progressive and anti-imperial movement. It has a lot to do with empowerment. It has a lot to do with abolitionism, suffragism, progressivism, sort of the international labor movement. All of this kind of has common cause. And so that was what I looked at, for most of the first half of the book. And then I came to a brown bag lecture series and presented my findings to my colleagues here at Villanova University. And one of my colleagues, Jennifer Dixon, whose office is across the hallway here, she says, okay, well, if I'm supposed to buy your argument that temperance and prohibitionism was a progressive movement of indigenous sort of self-determination against sort of predatory capitalism, where are the Native Americans? Where are the Native Americans in your story? And I said, you got me. They're not there. And it was that one question that effectively turned it into this massive book. It added 2 more years to the research project. It doubled the length of it, because what happens then is when you sort of put on this different perspective, all these things from American history that don't make a whole lot of sense, based upon this idea that it was just this conservative reaction, suddenly make a whole lot of sense. And you find out that actually the first prohibitionists in this country are its first peoples. And the first federal prohibitions that we have don't come just with the 18th Amendment. They go all the way back to 1802, when Thomas Jefferson, at the behest of local Native American tribes, pushes Congress to pass, a prohibition, not of alcohol again, but of trading and selling alcohol to Native Americans in the areas that are not under state or territorial jurisdiction, the so-called Indian country. And so all of a sudden, now we have this huge swath of American history that just doesn't get examined because we haven't really thought to look for it, because it doesn't fit the conventional narratives of temperance and prohibitionism. So that's the long walk around a very long book. So I'll leave it at that.
No, I appreciate that. And I want to transition from that to asking Brannon, as we talk about from a legal or procedural standpoint, maybe this will help shed some light on why we needed a constitutional amendment rather than just passing a law from Congress top down. Congress is going to tell you what you need to do. Talk about that a little bit. Why a constitutional amendment?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that the Supreme Court had made it very difficult for states to enact bans on, again, the importation of alcohol into their states. It's without risking inducing dormancy in the audience, I will briefly explain the Dormant Commerce Clause doctrine. It's a set of judge-made rules that has been around for a really long time that limits the ability of states to discriminate against or otherwise unduly burden interstate commerce. And for a time, there was an additional doctrine that said that states did not have the power to regulate items in interstate commerce, and the items never really exited interstate commerce until they were taken out of their so-called original packages. And so that meant that from the moment that the liquor would come in a crate or a case or whatever, until you broke that up, you couldn't, the states could regulate. So in other words, you would go pick up your liquor at the station, and even though the state was putatively dry, it had no authority to regulate that. So Congress passed a couple of acts that redelegated the power to regulate alcohol to the states, as it could do under case law. It could sort of give states the power to regulate commerce in a way that the Dormant Commerce Clause doctrine would otherwise prohibit. But there was fear that Congress would backslide, that those obviously, a subsequent Congress could always come along and repeal those laws and take away that power. And so it was thought that that really what you needed was a constitutional amendment that made clear that states that just sort of as a matter of our fundamental law, alcohol was going to be prohibited for everybody. And they managed to get it. I think, I agree with Mark. I think it was a sort of a confluence of progressives and women and nativists who were suspicious of these German immigrants. It was billed as a war aim, that prohibition was something that associated with the war effort in the First World War. And so it turned out to be very popular for a time anyway.
It seems as though wet or dry might have been an original political litmus test, right? Was this kind of the original single subject voter issue akin to gun rights, gun control, or abortion?
Yeah, I think so. And it was one of those that sort of split families. There's a family story from my mother's side that my Aunt Gussie in Middle Georgia was very active in the WTCU, and it was said that her husband, Uncle Bird, fully supported her in her efforts by drinking up everything in Washington County, Georgia, that he could find, to make sure that her efforts were successful. So yeah, I think that was not an uncommon story at the time, particularly in rural areas.
Yeah, I once told my dad I was just helping him out with a Starbucks gift card by spending it for him. So it sounds like maybe your family has a similar history there. Mark, you spent quite a bit of time in the book discussing a fellow with quite the name, William Pussyfoot Johnson. Why is he so influential in the history of Prohibition? And I guess the follow-on is, who's going to play him in the movie? There's got to be a movie made about him, or at least a wonderful book written about him. Tell us more about this guy.
Yeah, so Pussyfoot Johnson, actually, he's the guy who's gonna. I'm currently writing his biography, and have been wanting to do this for a long time. He's with apologies to the Dos Equis guy. I swear he's the most interesting man in the world. And so he was a prohibitionist, right? So he was started off as the chief prohibition officer in the Indian country of what is now, eastern Oklahoma. And so the idea was that he was supposed to be rooting out people who were legally selling alcohol and trading alcohol with the Native American tribes. So he was put there by Teddy Roosevelt, was part of this whole thing. Eventually becomes a big player in the Anti-Saloon League, which is sort of the main pressure group that gets us to prohibition and prohibitionism, and then becomes the sort of international commissar or international ambassador for the dry cause, and spends a lot of time, like every place I was going, and every place I was doing a case study, Pussyfoot was there, right? So he was in the Russian underground meeting with Lenin. He was in India meeting with Gandhi and all these he's everywhere doing all this sorts of stuff. And I was like, he's in 1920 he loses an eye in a riot in London that started because he was giving a speech, right? And it's like, nobody has any idea of who this guy is, but he's there, and it sort of gives this idea of not only temperance and but also prohibition as kind of like this international movement, transnational advocacy networks of people like-minded, networking with one another, and he was at the forefront of it. And so seeing these linkages between temperance, seeing these linkages between temperance and suffragism and temperance and abolitionism, and not just in one context in the United States, but globally, he becomes a very important part of this. And to answer your question, it has to be Tom Hanks. Right. It just has to be. He's getting up there in age. And actually, I know this for a fact that Tom Hanks knows about Pussyfoot Johnson, because I actually, you see, I've got a lot of typewriters and whatnot. I actually correspond with Tom Hanks via typewriter. And so I know he knows of it. But I don't know if there's a movie in the works, but
was the first draft of this book written on a typewriter? And if so, how long did that take to type up?
Oh, God, no. No, I couldn't imagine doing something like that. I thought about the new book. I thought about maybe like the final draft, maybe one chapter, do it in typewritten. But yeah, there's just too much moving around footnotes and all that stuff. It'd be forever.
Absolutely. I didn't actually write this question up for you yet, but as a Spanish linguistics major myself, I was fascinated by the etymology of alcohol, and I think there's a chapter in here talking about the Ottoman Empire, and sort of the origin of the word of alcohol. Maybe can you jump into that a little bit for us? I think that might be interesting for folks to hear. I think they might say, similar to Russia, there's not a lot of Midwest Bible thumpers in Russia touting prohibition, but people might be interested to hear the origins of this word being Arabic. And maybe thinking, hold on a second, that doesn't necessarily square with what I know. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of the art of distillation. Is originally came from the Arabs. So al-kuhul was the name for the product of distillation, and that was sort of an ancient discovery, but only I guess in the 1400s, 1500s do you start to have sort of I guess Europeans coming into this from sort of looking for the elixir of life, to develop aqua vitae, the water of life, as this sort of elixir to cure our ailments and so on, and that becomes aquavit in other countries, which is synonymous with distilled spirits. because that's effectively what it is, right? So it's so interesting to see sort of that evolution, first from the Arabs back in the day to the Genoese probably in the 1400s, and then that kind of spreads throughout Europe, and then it washes up as vodka in Poland and Russia, it washes up as gin in the Low Countries, and whiskey, brandy, whatever you want to call it, it all takes on its kind of more contemporary flavors at that point.
Sure. Wonderful. I know your Twitter handle is Vodka Politics, so certainly a vested interest here. And I was going to ask, had your work in Russian studies drawn you much into this? And I think that's a definite yes as well there.
Oh yeah. Well, that was
yeah.
the Vodka Politics, but I had a colleague who, we were talking about going to Russia and doing field work in Russia, and he just said, alcoholism is it's part of the terrain. It's a professional hazard. You have to know, whether you drink or not, you have to know that this is coming down the line, and just that question of why for a long time kind of primed my own interest in, why is it Russians drink so much, and why do they drink this awful stuff called vodka? And it's and that was what got me into the I guess the Vodka Politics book, was looking at that deep history of political and economic decisions that kind of get ensconced into cultural practices, to the point we see vodka as being synonymous with Russia nowadays.
Yeah. Well, I want to move from 18th Amendment. Obviously, we mentioned 19th Amendment, a personal favorite of mine. 20th is a little boring, but up here to 21st Amendment, as mentioned at the top of the hour, we're marking the 90th anniversary of its ratification today. Brannon, talk to us a little bit about the 21st Amendment, if you would. Maybe, is it still relevant today? You obviously helped write the introduction of Toward Liquor Control. Are the observations of 1933 still relevant to today?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned that as dissatisfaction with prohibition, and more importantly with its enforcement, the rise of organized crime, et cetera, it really became, it was in fact a campaign issue for Franklin Roosevelt. He promised to work for repeal, and then the question was what would replace it. And the 21st Amendment, there was a lot of debate over who should have pride of place in alcohol regulation. And I'm satisfied, although unfortunately the Supreme Court has disagreed, I'm satisfied that what the framers of the 21st Amendment intended was to really disable the Dormant Commerce Clause doctrine once and for all when it came to state alcohol regulation. And so Section 2 makes clear that the states do take the lead. And initially, the Supreme Court understood that to give the states pretty much a free hand in the regulation of alcohol. And that lasted until the 60s and 70s in a series of decisions where the court said, no, that's not what they meant. The Dormant Commerce Clause still limits states to a degree, although we recognize that alcohol is special. That sort of culminated in the 2005 Granholm decision, where the court said that whatever else the states might do, it can't discriminate against out-of-state alcohol to the benefit of in-state producers or distributors. And it did say, though, and this was an outgrowth of the 21st Amendment and the sort of the blueprint for what alcohol regulation ought to look like, was Fosdick and Scott's Towards Liquor Control, which was funded in part by Rockefeller, who himself was sort of a prohibitionist, but he recognized that prohibition was just not something that Americans were going to be sold on. So the idea came about, well, we want to prevent a return to the saloon. So how do you do that? Well, first, you do it by passing tied house laws so that you would break up the connection between producers and retailers. And then you would insert a distributor. So that's where the so-called three-tier system comes along, where producers or manufacturers of alcohol are required to sell to distributors, which in turn deal to retailers, which then retail to consumers. And this three-tier system, which the court has called unquestionably legitimate, still remains a kind of bedrock of alcohol regulation in the country. And the 21st Amendment really, made it clear that the states would take the lead. Most of the states adopted some version of the three-tier system, and it's largely the blueprint from which alcohol regulation, or on which alcohol regulation remains to this day.
Yeah, I guess as we're celebrating 90 years, looks pretty great for 90 years, 90 years old. What does 90 years from now look like? And is there relevance to public policy debates today, maybe surrounding cannabis, opioids, etc.? What are your thoughts? Either one of you here.
Well, I think that there's no question the three-tier system is under attack by, people sort of have gotten used to convenience. They've gotten used to 24/7 availability of all sorts of products. And, I think in some quarters, there's a kind of rush to forget that, alcohol is unique. It's a unique product. It generates significant negative externalities, which is, of course, why it was the subject of a social movement that resulted in its prohibition for a time. And I think that as people sort of, the rise of craft brewers, craft distillers, there's kind of a sense that they ought to be entitled to sell directly to consumers. And I think that, unfortunately, we've sort of lost a little bit. It's the 90th anniversary of the ratification is a really nice opportunity to reflect on and recover the understanding of why alcohol laws look the way that they do. What was the purpose? It wasn't just simply to enrich, the distributor class or whatever. It really was an attempt to adjust to the reality that Americans were just not buying prohibition without returning to the conditions that sort of catalyzed its prohibition in the first place.
Yeah, Mark, anything to add to that?
Oh yeah, a lot. There's a lot that kind of continues through. And last month I was actually in New York City, giving a talk about the book to the Worldwide Brewing Alliance, which is all these brewers from around the globe, as you might expect. It might seem to a weird thing to be, talking about temperance and prohibition to a bunch of alcohol manufacturers, brewers in particular. But I learned a lot from this engagement because the same dynamics that I was describing in the book leading up to prohibition, in particular, as Brannon was talking about, like with the Tide House systems and the saloons, you're starting to see that happen again. So a lot of these brewers are getting upset that they are getting roped in increasingly with sort of the global distillers. And in many cases, if you go back to prohibitionism, beer was kind of oftentimes seen as like almost like a temperance drink, especially in the big cities. It's something you do at the end of the day, whereas I guess to use sort of Marxist terminology, like liquor was like for the lumpen proletariat, like the lowest of the low, the most degenerates. And it was the liquor that was, the liquor industry that was, sort of probably the most guilty party in some of the worst excesses of the saloon and of the liquor traffic. And the brewers kind of get roped in by association. And so, speaking to this group of a lot of brewers, they're like, oh, this has happened before. This was not necessarily a good thing. Maybe it would be good for us to maybe stake more of our identity less with the distillers because they also make alcohol, but with sort of regulators and putting beer ahead as being maybe not a temperance drink, but at least a responsible drink, and making common cause with alcohol control policies and not fighting them tooth and nail, because that's what led to prohibition the last time around. And so it's fascinating to see that even people in the industry were cognizant of the similarities between now and then in ways that I wasn't even thinking at that point.
If you want to see, if you want a good visual depiction, William Hogarth has a famous painting that contrasts Beer Alley with Gin Lane. Mm-hmm. And, Beer Alley, everybody's prosperous. having a beer. It's seen as very virtuous. And you switch over to Gin Alley that's got women, pox, on their face and dangling babies out of windows and rats feasting on corpses and stuff. So clearly the contrast was typically Hogarthian subtlety at work there.
Oh yeah, and taking a global perspective, you see that all over the place, right? And so in Russia, it was the kabak, with vodka that gave you that deprivation. But in the German Empire back in the day, they had that same distinction between the German beer hall, like we know from Oktoberfest, Munich, bright, airy, where people go after the day. The other one in Germany was the Schnapsholle, and that was the place where you just the lowest of the low drunkard crawled in, to get mind-numbingly blasted and then crawl out again, if that, right? Maybe there is no crawling out if you drink yourself to death. And so that became a big thing, sort of politically, was differentiating between beer as a good alcoholic beverage, whereas the distilled liquors had these negative associations with them. And you're right. I mean, in many ways, the saloon, whether you're talking about Germany or Russia or South Africa or the United States, that's, I think, the one thing that people seem to overlook, right? That we look back now at the Prohibition era, and we hear the word saloon, and we think, oh, like Wild West, kicking the doors, swinging gates and whatnot. But the saloons were just awful places. It's not like, talking about the saloon as a mere synonym for a tavern today or or a bar. And the one anecdote that really hammered this home to me was one that I use in the introduction to the book. And that's sort of the character of Carrie Nation, who's kind of this avatar of prohibitionism, the Midwestern Bible thumping, she's got her hatchet and goes in smashing saloons in Kansas in the year 1900 and setting all the bar flies, to flight. The thing that got me out of this was that was finding out when she was doing her hatchetations, when she was going in and smashing saloons. Usually she was doing it around 7:00 in the morning. And so setting these drunkards to flight, because there were no closing times. There was no regulation. These were people who had been drinking all night through. And it wasn't like Cheers, where the bartender's there to bend your ear and, serve you a beer and be very social and pack you in a cab when things are done, like Sam Malone on Cheers. No, they're there once they get you in. There's no financial incentive to send a drunkard home because that's money that you're losing. You're letting it walk right out the door. So you keep people in the saloon and you keep them drinking until they have nothing left. And that was, just that idea that these are people who had been drinking all night and then into the next morning was one of those things that just kind of made me realize, wow, this is just a completely different realm than what I'm used to. And if there is a consequence to this for, the question of maybe an unasked question about prohibition and prohibitionism, I would say that an argument could be made. I'm not going to be the one to make it, that prohibitionism may have actually worked because it got rid of the worst excesses of the saloon, the liquor traffic. That is the thing that it was supposed to be about. By getting rid of the saloon and instituting these types of regulations and giving us the Fosdicks and Scotts and the idea that there is an appropriate role of government in this to make sure that those worst excesses of 24-hour saloons and brothels and gambling halls and all the horrible things that come with that are definitely a thing of the past.
Yeah, just to add, I think there's a good deal of literature out there that does suggest that alcohol-related causes of death and disease were in fact reduced, came down dramatically during the period of Prohibition. So,
guys, I have a question. Someone is asking me, Mark, the sign in the background of your room here, is that part of the propaganda that you've mentioned? And tell us some more about it. Someone wants to know.
Oh yeah, that's an old Soviet sort of propaganda poster. It says "Bej po vragu kulturной revolucija," right? So we're going to smash at the enemies of the Cultural Revolution. not the Chinese culture, this is sort of Bolshevik era, but the idea that this was part of temperance and prohibitionism in Russia. Again, it was not a conservative movement. You ended up having a lot of the Bolsheviks, including Lenin and Trotsky, were diehard prohibitionists because they understood that growing up in the old Russian Empire, the Tsars, where they had a monopoly on selling vodka to the people. That's how effectively 1/3 of all revenue in the Russian Empire came from the vodka monopoly, selling alcohol to your own boozy peasants. And so you ended up having Bolshevism in particular in Russia was kind of a revolutionary prohibitionist movement, and so you have Lenin and so on. The idea that they were going to, if alcohol was the way that the rich got richer and the poor got poorer, well, then we should, in principle, maybe not based just upon taste, whether we like booze or not, we should stand up on principle and be against this particular dynamic. So yeah, that's like, I guess a remnant from the 1920s, 1930s era in the Soviet Union that eventually they, as Lenin was a prohibitionist and held on to prohibition throughout his few years in power, but as Stalin comes into power and elbows out, Trotsky, who was also this prohibitionist. Stalin is the guy who brings back the old czarist vodka monopoly, except now he puts a hammer and a sickle on it and ratchets it back up to build sort of the might of the Soviet Empire on the, I guess the drunken livers of Soviet citizens.
All of these wonderful tidbits I can imagine are in here and more. Would you share with us where we can best find this book? I know stocking stuffer. I have a big stocking at home, so I think this would fit, but I also have my own copy. But where can we find your book? What's the best place to find your book before we turn back for some final thoughts and maybe head over to some Q&A too?
Oh yeah, just Amazon.com is fine. It's probably the easiest way to find, or your local independent booksellers, since it is that the holiday season.
Wonderful. So yeah, we've talked about Smashing the Liqour Machine. We've also mentioned Toward Liquor Control, which the center did republish with Brannon's addition to an introduction of a 21st century edition of that. And this can be found on the center's website, or I think it's also, yes, available on Amazon. I think you can even get it in Kindle version, so it travels quite nicely. Guys, we're running out of time, but any additional thoughts before I turn it over for maybe a couple quick questions?
All right. Yeah, I would say that I think that these issues, it's even more important to reflect on the lessons from alcohol regulation as more and more states legalize cannabis. There's some irony in some of the fact that some supporters of legalization are also simultaneously critics of state-based alcohol regulation features like the 3-tier system, because when pressed, particularly early in the legalization debate, a lot of people sort of defaulted to saying, well, we just sort of regulate it like we regulate alcohol. And the fact that we have a 9-year-old regulatory regime that still is very effective, and effective too, not only in sort of avoiding the abuses of the past, but also, guarding against something that plagues a lot of other countries, which is counterfeit alcohol and adulterated alcohol. We don't have those problems in this country, largely, I think, because of the 3-tier system and the fact that you can track product as it goes through the supply chain, or if something goes wrong, you can track it back. And I think that's something that often gets overlooked as one of the benefits of state-based alcohol regulation.
Brannon, that's a wonderful point to make, and there is a fantastic report that was written a few years ago, published by the Center for Alcohol Policy, about fake alcohol and interstate e-commerce. I just dropped a link in the chat if anyone would like to take a look at that. But thank you for that addition. I do have a question here that it's rather long, so in the interest of time, I'll summarize into the asker. Forgive me for the summary, but the question is essentially, how is toward liquor control still relevant when all the pressure is from the retailer or on the retailers from maybe some global chains and global entities here? So maybe talk about the relevance of toward liquor control today, given that perspective.
Well, I mean, I think there is pressure, and it's I think worth revisiting, both as a reminder of what the conditions, what was the background against which Fosdick and Scott were making recommendations, and I think that we may, it may be worth revisiting those and trying to relearn lessons that may have gotten forgotten, particularly or gotten obscured in the debates over deregulation and convenience and some of the deregulatory arguments that get made. So I still think it's relevant.
Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat, but if people have any follow-ups, please send them to me. I'm sure our panel members here would be happy to connect on follow-up questions. And a reminder again, please do pick up a copy of Mark's book. I haven't finished it yet, Mark. I promise that I will. It's blast, I'm sure. Of course, 2 professors. I saw that one coming. Wonderful. Well, thank you again, both of you, for your time. Happy Repeal Day to everybody, 90th anniversary here. I think cheers responsibly. And thank you again, and we'll go ahead and wrap this up. I do want to make note that we'll have this published on our YouTube channel in the coming weeks. If you'd like to revisit it and share it with some friends, I'm sure they would be fascinated, along with the rest of the 108 nerds who have joined us today. I think there are more of us out there. So thank you again, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you.
Thanks.